Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to welcome you to the Baker Institute again this evening. I see a lot of familiar faces in the audience. The topic of tonight's event is one that is dear to me and many Houstonians, the excellence in leadership personified by our nation's 41st President, George Herbert Walker Bush. President Bush is a man who, whether as an 18-year-old naval aviator in World War II or as President of the United States of America, embodies the very best in public spirit. Having served our nation with distinction in times of war and peace, President Bush led his administration to bring the Cold War to its peaceful conclusion, not with a bang, but with a whimper, to shape the successful unification of Germany and create international coalition that reversed Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait in Desert Storm. President Bush and his Secretary of State, James A. Baker III, the namesake of this institute, also advanced the cause of Arab-Israeli peace. President Bush's administration's skillful diplomacy brought Arabs and Israelis together for face-to-face negotiations in Madrid. That was the first time in history that the Israelis and the Arabs collectively met in face-to-face negotiations. And they crucially created a climate of trust that made possible the Oslo Accords and the Treaty of Peace subsequently between Israel and Jordan. There's no question that the close personal and professional relationship between President Bush and Secretary Baker facilitated the conduct of U.S. diplomacy in a most successful manner. I believe it's a model that should be followed. On a personal note, both President Bush 41 and President Bush 43 and Secretary Baker were together this morning at the funeral of one of their closest friends, Robert Mosbacher Sr. I have mentioned but a few of President Bush's many accomplishments. 2 decades later, they stand the test of time, in my view. Historians will undoubtedly say the same in years to come. President Bush represents patriotism and public service at their very best. And this is exactly the themes that our speaker this evening will address. Our speaker has been the executive director of the George Bush Presidential Library Foundation since 1999. He's a career member of the Foreign Service and an American of Ukrainian origin. He served as the first United States ambassador to the Ukraine between 1992 and 1993. Prior to his appointment as ambassador, he unfortunately succeeded me as deputy assistant to President Reagan and deputy press secretary for foreign affairs. I'm older than Roman is, so there's not a generation gap, but a little age gap there. Yeah. Clearly what they say about the Lone Star State rings true. Roman and I obviously weren't born in Texas, but we finally got smart and came here. Our speaker is the recipient of numerous awards, including the Department of State Superior Honor Award and the Meritorious Honor Award. Roman, it gives me great pleasure to congratulate you on the publication of your book, which is available to all of you in the Doré Commons after the talk tonight. So please join me in welcoming Ambassador Popadiuk to the
Can you hear me? Okay, I just got to make sure I get this set right. Ed, thank you very much for that very kind introduction and invitation to be here. It's a great honor to be here at the Baker Institute. I had the pleasure of working with Secretary Baker when I was at the White House during President Bush's administration. And I have to say that Jim Baker is one of the finest secretaries of state this country has had. And I'll try to relate some of the activities that he participated in a little later on in my discussions. Likewise, it's very nice to be here because of Ed's origin. Ed mentioned that I succeeded him during the Reagan administration, but it's very hard to succeed Ed's origin. He's a true patriot and a true professional in his own right, and I had great pleasure working with him, and it's so nice to see what he's done with the Baker Institute in terms of the programming and establishing a strong foundation for the future here at Rice University. So congratulations on a job well done, Ed. The three of us, Baker, Ed, and I, share one thing in common. We all worked for George Bush in one capacity or another. And what I'd like to do tonight is kind of outline some of the perspectives of my relationship with President Bush, but not so much my relationship, but how George Bush managed the world. It's kind of strange to look back right now and realize it's 20 years since he was President of the United States. My, this time fly by very quickly. And just to remind you on the foreign policy front, some of the accomplishments that took place on his watch: the end of communism, the Soviet Union fell apart, all new independent states in the former Soviet Union as well as in Eastern Europe. Noriega was overthrown and democracy restored in Panama. The end of apartheid in South Africa. A lot of people forget about the president's role in that. And the restoration of democracy in Nicaragua with free elections. So it's quite an accomplishment there when you start looking beyond just the European parts of it. And when you look back at it, there was quite a bit of accomplishments. And it's at the time that the president was undertaking all these accomplishments, he didn't get much credit. There was a lot of criticism, and I'd like to return to that. But right now, there's a certain nostalgia for George Bush, 41. People talk about the foreign policy successes, and I just outlined some of them. But people also talk about two other things. They talk about the process and the people that were in his administration. The president had a process in place in terms of decision making that was very effective and congenial and very much successful. And the people that surrounded the president were key to that policy process and to that success. And some of those people were Jim Baker, of course, and Brent Scowcroft, who was the National Security Advisor. So people look at the accomplishments and they look at the process, and there's a nostalgia to see, why can't this be brought back now? Why can't this function in our Washington now? But when you look back 20 years ago, when we were in the White House, it wasn't so. We got criticized for being reactive. Here's a guy who has no vision. You know, the vision thing they said about President Bush. He has no new ideas. He's just a caretaker government succeeding President Reagan. Nothing was further from the truth. So what I'd like to do probably in the next 20 or so minutes is kind of balance that view of 20 years ago with what he actually accomplished, and kind of give you an idea by peeling the onion back a little bit of what George Bush was like as a man and also as a leader, and how he interacted with people and how he was able to succeed. If you look at the president's term in office, he came into office with two strong challenges to overcome, first of all. The first one was the legacy of Ronald Reagan himself. George Bush was Ronald Reagan's vice president for 8 years, and he served him with great distinction. But there were two challenges that Bush faced and that played in the public perception of what the president was all about, President Bush was all about. The first one was that during Reagan's administration, George Bush was a very loyal vice president, as he should have been. He kept his advice to himself, did not share it with others, and did not share it, most of all, with the public, such as the press. The perception grew up, therefore, that the president was an individual who really didn't have any ideas or wasn't forceful in terms of presenting policy or pursuing policy objectives. Nothing is further from the truth. I would just remind those of you who followed those years of him being vice president is that he took, I think, at least 2 trips in 1984 to Europe, and he was instrumental in getting the Allies to accept the placement of Pershing missiles in Europe. And of course, this helped beef up the the Atlantic Alliance vis-a-vis the Soviet Union. It was one of the steps in the process of leading to the dissolution of the Soviet Union, because our Western military strength was being built up, and the Soviets couldn't match that. So George Bush did it in a very quiet and in an unassuming manner, as is his nature. The second problem that George Bush faced in the wake of Ronald Reagan was, and I'll have to be honest about this, was communication. The Gipper, and God love him, I worked for him, admired him. He could give a speech, and there was no doubt about it. He could give a good speech. George Bush had a little bit of a hard time with speeches. His syntax, his inability to stop at an applause line. We would always kind of hope for him to stop at an applause line, but he would just kind of keep on going. And then he had a tendency, at times, to when he gave a speech to acknowledge everyone in the audience, so it seemed like he was backing into a speech at times rather than actually delivering a speech. He himself realized the problems he had in terms of speeches, so when he came into office, there was a big difference between him and President Reagan in terms of how he addressed the public. Those of you who may recall, Ronald Reagan gave many East Room news conferences. Very formal, dignified atmosphere. President Bush just did the reverse. I think it was one formal news conference that we had in the East Room. Everything else was held in the White House briefing room, much like this auditorium. The president would walk in, give a short, brief opening statement, and just take questions. President Bush liked to be informal. He didn't like to be staged. He liked to be George Bush, always on the go. And that kind of attitude and that kind of presentation suited him very, very nicely, his personality. And so as a result of that, he was never one to be a great speech maker. And of course, if you're not a great orator, there's a perception that you're not possibly a great leader. And nothing is further from the truth in George Bush. His communication skills were lacking, but his leadership skills were not lacking at all. So that's some of the legacy problems he had to deal with. The other one was the press itself. The problem with the press was twofold for President Bush. On an individual basis, the president had numerous individuals in the press with whom he got along with very, very well. He considered them his personal friends. He hosted the press. I remember a barbecue once at Kenny Bunkport for the press. Very congenial, very open. But when it came to the professional give and take of the president and the press, there were two issues that the president was very much concerned about. One was the gotcha politics that has developed in Washington, D.C. No matter what you do, no matter what you say, the press is going to be critical and attack you. And I could recollect two specific stories that the president was a little bit upset about, and those of you who are old enough may remember some of these stories yourselves. One had to do with the scanner story. I don't know if you recall this or not. The president went down to a National Grocers Association meeting, convention, and National Cash Register had developed a new scanner. Those of you who go to the grocery store, and imagine it's everyone here, you go and you scan it and it goes beep and it tells you the price and all that stuff. Well, at that time they developed a new scanner which was able to read a crumpled code. At that time that was revolutionary. If it's crumpled now, when you have a bag of bread and something that doesn't scan, you got to go 5 times. Well, these new scanners could read and even rip with code bars and everything. So the president was kind of amazed about that. Well, Andy Rosenthal, who was not even the president at the event, read a pool report on the event and wrote a story for the New York Times that the president's kind of out of touch, doesn't know what's going on in American society, et cetera, et cetera. And this became a big story. Even though the president himself wrote a letter to the New York Times and National Cash Register, tried to correct the story by approaching the New York Times, the original story stuck. So you could see that the president always had a kind of a nervous attitude toward the press. The second incident was when the Berlin Wall came down. November 9th, 1989, the Berlin Wall came down. A very important historic event in European history, obviously in German history, and obviously in the East-West relationship. It was decided the president had to say something to the press. Of course, the press was clamoring for it, so we had to say something. What was decided to be done was that a press pool of about 10 or 11 photographers, print journalists, and broadcast journalists would be brought into the Oval Office, and the president would address them. We did that. The press came in, the president sat behind his chair and kind of lackadaisical in attitude and kind of, yawning, said, yeah, this is a nice event. And obviously I'm paraphrasing here, I don't recall exactly his words. But in other words, there wasn't any emotion there. Well, the big story of the thing was, the press criticized him because this was such a great event, but he wasn't dancing on the wall, he wasn't celebrating, he wasn't declaring the Cold War over. So we got a lot of criticism for that. unknown to the public and to the press, before we brought the press in the Oval Office, he basically instructed the staff, there will be no gloating. There is a lot of work to be done still. While the Berlin Wall came down, it didn't mean that Germany was unified. It didn't mean East Germany was free yet. It didn't mean that perestroika and glasnost, which were taking place in the Soviet Union, had succeeded. It meant that this is one step in a long process, and how we reacted to that specific event of the Berlin Wall coming down can affect the unraveling of the rest of the process, or the evolution of the rest of the process. The president was very cognizant that there were reactionary forces present in the Soviet Union that would be very detrimental to Gorbachev in terms of moving perestroika forward. If they saw the West gloating, or the West trying to take advantage of something that was taking place in Germany and in Eastern Europe, there might be a revolution or a coup against Gorbachev. And as you realize, 2 years later, there was a coup, attempted coup that failed against Gorbachev by these very forces. So the president showed a lot of instinct, a lot of good judgment in terms of holding back emotion. He knew when to be emotional. He also knew when not to be emotional in terms of pushing U.S. policy forward. But he got a lot of criticism at that time. Now, when you look at George Bush, and let me go into the man a little bit and his management style and how it affected policy. When you meet George Bush, the first thing you realize, he's a very unassuming individual, self-effacing. He doesn't like to take credit for events. He likes to give credit to the guy next to him. He doesn't like to boast. And this comes from his upbringing. And I'll just relay a few anecdotes. When he was a youngster in school still, he remembers that he had called home to tell his mother that he had scored a number of goals in a soccer game. He was very proud of that, as any young man would be. But he remembers that his mother interrupted him in his boastful manner and asked him, "George, how did the team do?" So that drove home to him that it's teamwork and not the individual that mattered, that you had to work as a team. He is also very cognizant of the role of prayer in his life. And you'd hear Barbara Bush even say now that George Bush prays every night. He even prays for people who have hurt him. That's the type of individual he is. He holds his Christian faith very dear. It doesn't wear it on his sleeve, but he realizes that he's been blessed. Those of you who have followed his life story know full well that as a 19-year-old fighter pilot, he was shot down in the Pacific and was rescued. His two co-pilots in the plane perished when they parachuted out of the airplane. So there's always been in the back of his mind the notion that he was blessed by God, and he feels a duty to serve the country and to serve his family. But in the same manner, his family upbringing is one of not being an assuming individual, of being self-effacing. And, just to give you an idea, when he was a youngster, he had this tendency to share. If he had anything, he gave half of it to his buddy or a new friend, etc. So much so, and I don't know how many of you may know this, his nickname when he was a youth was Have Half. That was his name. They called him Have Half because when he had something, he gave half of it to his buddy. So that's the kind of individual you were dealing with when you dealt with George Bush. This kind of self-effacing personality was dovetailed at the same time with a personality of dealing with people on a personal basis. George Bush didn't give great speeches, as I mentioned at the outset. George Bush wasn't a great communicator, but one-on-one, he was brilliant and very effective. He could communicate one-on-one or in small groups very readily and in a very articulate fashion. Anyone that dealt with him on a one-on-one basis or in a small group environment always walked away with great respect for him. You may not agree with what he said, which is fine, he didn't care, but you respected him for his open-mindedness, for his pleasant personality, and for his willingness to hear and listen to everyone. And George Bush always stays in touch with everyone. If you shook his hand, chances are pretty good you got a phone call or a handwritten note from him. You became part of his orbit. You became part of his friendship circle. He is a consistent letter writer and a telephone caller, and now he's a persistent emailer with all the misspellings and everything that are in there. Yeah. But he is persistent in that. And that played a great role in his success in foreign policy. When he was at the United Nations, he had a tendency to walk the halls. He would get out of the office and just walk down the corridors and meet Ambassador so-and-so or Delegate so-and-so and get to know all these people. So much so that when he gave his first General Assembly speech in 1989, in September 1989 at the United Nations, he knew a lot of people in the audience. They had now become foreign ministers or ambassadors to their countries on a bilateral basis or to the UN or etc. And so he acknowledged a lot of the people in the audience. He always kept ties, and that was part of the strength of his leadership. People knew they could get a personal hearing from George Bush, and as Gorbachev said, trust is the most important thing in international affairs, and you could always trust George Bush. And that's what he brought through that personal characteristics of reaching out and dealing with people, and that was very, very important in foreign policy. It was not only important in terms of him reaching out to people with his telephone diplomacy, but it was also important for foreign leaders. They felt comfortable to pick up the phone and call him. So, for example, when we were going in the lead up to the Gulf War, President Ozol would call President Bush whenever he'd hear something on CNN that he thought was frightening, and he would call the president to talk about it. There was a comfort level about these things. When Gorbachev stopped in Canada en route to the United States for a meeting with George Bush, he had meetings with Mulroney, Prime Minister Mulroney in Canada. Afterwards, the president and Mulroney spoke. What did Gorbachev say? What does he expect when he comes and meets with me? That's the kind of diplomacy he carried out, a very personal diplomacy, which I think to a great extent, and Ed, you could probably relate to this, kept the State Department very, very much on its toes, because there were times the president would be talking with Brent Scowcroft, his national security advisor, or be reading a paper and call Brent in and say, well, let's call this guy, this leader, and get a little bit more information. Well, you know, as Ed would know and I know from State Department days, whenever heads of state would try to talk to each other, there'd be briefing papers, there'd be translators present, there'll be note takers taken. Well, in these situations, the president would just want to pick up the phone and call. But that's the kind of diplomacy he carried on, and it was very effective when it came to paving trust and establishing a good relationship with other leaders. The other thing I would point to is Bush's management style. George Bush, based on his personality and his unassuming nature, when he ran a meeting, he didn't have to be the center of a meeting. He very seldom said much in meetings, actually. He had a tendency to sit back and listen to what people around the table were saying. And the reason for this is he was very cognizant of the fact that you would get more information out of people if they didn't know what you thought. Because once, there was always the fear on his part that if he spoke up, people would try to cater their thoughts to meet the thoughts of the president. You know, and he always wanted the unvarnished truth, as he would say. And the best way to get the unvarnished truth was to sit back and to listen to what people had to say. He had a tendency, after a meeting, however, to call a person aside and have a little bit more of an in-depth discussion on an issue. Okay? He also had a tendency to reach out to people. I remember particularly in three issue areas, China, the Middle East, and the Soviet Union. He would have professors come in, and he would meet in very informal manners at Kennebunkport, for example, or at Camp David, to have these faculty people discuss in their expertise on the various areas of the world. He had a tendency to touch base with with government officials throughout the bureaucracy. In other words, he didn't rely solely on the briefing papers or on the advice that his own national security advisors or that Baker or that Scowcroft or other individuals would give him. He did reach out, and he had a areas of information that he was able to pick from. This gave him a great broad knowledge of the scene in foreign affairs and of an issue. The other thing is, he was very, I hate to use this word, but I will, very prudent. I'm sure you've heard that word before. And he had a systematic approach, which at the time led to a lot of criticism of him. And I'll give you an example. When we came into office, when the president came into office, he instituted a 90-day review of U.S. foreign policy from A to Z. Even though it had been a friendly takeover from the Reagan administration, the president wanted to get a fresh look at all the issues that were challenging the United States. This 90-day review went on, but we got a lot of criticism from the press as to why the president had no new initiatives. You know, here's February gone by, nothing happens. March has gone by, nothing happens. The only thing the president could say in foreign policy is, wait a minute, we're reviewing it, we'll get to you. And the point I'm trying to make is he would not be stampeded into a decision or into a statement if the time wasn't ripe. He was in self-control. He was in control of the foreign policy machinery. And if you recall those days, once we got into April, so we had two key speeches. One in April of '89 in Hamtramck, Michigan, regarding Polish reform in the United States, reaching out to Poland, what the Poles and Eastern Europe could expect from the United States if reform kept moving forward. And then the speech in Texas A&M University in May of 1989, outlining the threshold that the Soviet Union needed to pass in order to have better relations with the West. And then at the end of May, beginning of June, at the NATO summit, he unveiled the CFE proposal, not CFE, but the lowering of conventional forces in Europe. So he had policies that came from that policy review, is what I'm trying to say, but he would not be stampeded into it, but he got a lot of negative criticism from the press that he was being reactive, wasn't being proactive in foreign policy. As I said, that was then, but now people are starting to realize when they look back the benefits of that kind of approach. The other thing I would like to mention is the teamwork, and I alluded to this early on. The president had a great team. I'm not going to talk about the process because that gets a little boring with bureaucracy and all, but he had two key advisors, Jim Baker and Brent Scowcroft. I don't think the president could have had any better advisors. I think he himself would say that. The president would never take credit for anything. He would always point to Jim Baker and Brent Scowcroft as being key, as well as other individuals, Colin Powell, Dick Cheney, who was Secretary of Defense at the time, as being key in terms of advising him. But Baker and Scowcroft brought something to the table that really made the chemistry of the three of them operate very strongly. Those of you who know Jim Baker know he's a skilled negotiator, he's hard as nails, backbone of steel, pragmatic. If you want something done, you say, Jim, can you get it done? Jim will go and get it done. Brent Scowcroft, on the other hand, is more of a strategic thinker, a conceptual, has a PhD, so he has that academic bent to him. Also very unassuming individual, doesn't look to take credit for events. Conceptual thinker. Brent is the type of guy that says, what's the world going to look like 20 years from now, and how do we want it to look, and how do we get the United States positioned to deal with that, with the world? And so when you had a combination of the pragmatism of Jim Baker and the negotiating skill of Jim Baker and the conceptual vision of a Brent Scowcroft, and meshed that with the president who had a deep understanding of foreign policy, I think that was just a dynamic team. It was the right team at the right time in the right place. So when you look back at it, I can understand the nostalgia that is starting to develop for that kind of team and that kind of foreign policy. Now, what was the foreign policy, you say? It's nice that the president was unassuming, had a good management style, had a good team, overcame some of the early obstacles with the press, etc. But what was that foreign policy? It was very simple. I mean, he started with the same premise that all presidents start. The United States is a special country with a special role in the world. And in order to carry out that role, the United States needs to maintain a strong military and technological edge over all its competitors. But there are a number of points in this. Number one is the president was a firm believer in multilateralism. Even though the United States was the strongest state in the world at the time, with the Soviet Union crumbling, he believed that the United States had to act in a multilateral fashion. The reasons for this were very simple. If you acted in a multilateral fashion, you actually increased your own strength in a moral and in a military way. Militarily, obviously, because you have allies like in the Gulf War who can help out, and morally in the sense that it shows that you're working with the rest of the world community. You're not a lone state out there acting in a very arrogant manner. So you actually increased your strength if you acted in a multilateral manner. Another point of the president's foreign policy was transparency. He believed in carrying out as many steps in a very public way as possible to show the rest of the international community, as well as the American public, that he had done everything that was possible before a final decision had to be made. This was a classic case in the situation with the Gulf War, where Jim Baker traveled anywhere at any time to talk to anyone about trying to solve the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait in a peaceful manner. And the president always stated the phone calls he made or the talks that he had to try to solve this in a peaceful manner. And then so when the time came for the invasion, the president felt certain that the world community would understand. And if you look back at it, we had a coalition of about 30 states that readily supported us in this endeavor. So the president built up a very strong coalition through his transparency and through his multilateral approach to foreign policy. The third point I would mention about the president's policy was it was inclusive, and this kind of touches on the multilateral thing. But he tried to get every state to have a stake in a policy as much as possible. This goes back to my example of the Berlin Wall. If he had isolated the Soviet Union at that time by poking a finger in Gorbachev's eye, the ramifications, the negative ramifications would have been great, and there would have been no benefits to the United States. He believed in including everyone, making sure every state has some kind of stake in an individual decision. In other words, no gloating, and no isolating a state to make it feel that it's been pushed aside. Make every state feel as important as possible, because every state is important to the functioning of the international community, whether it's large or small. This concept of transparency, inclusiveness, and of multilateral diplomacy came together in what was called back then, and probably forgotten by history, the New World Order. The president spoke of the New World Order. The United States would be able to lead the world community, but not as a single power, but as a power in conjunction with the rest of the world community. Let me just give you a quick background. The United Nations had been created for the purpose of not only social and economic reform, but also peace and justice. The president felt that the social and economic reforms and duties of the United Nations had been met to a large extent quite successfully. The problem, of course, had been that the peacekeeping role of the United Nations had not been met, and that was as a result of the conflict of the Cold War between the United States and the Soviet Union. With the demise of the Soviet Union, or the crumbling of the Soviet Union, there was an opportunity to get the United Nations to act in a manner that was consistent with its original charter. So the president thought that there would be three pillars here. One, building democracy. Secondly, economic opportunity for all states and development. And third, peace and justice for all states through the mechanism of multilateral diplomacy. That's what he brought to the table. He outlined this in a number of speeches. First time, I think it was in September of 1990 when he spoke to the Congress. And then in 1991, he gave a speech, and there were references to the New World Order. It hit a blip here and there in the press, but then obviously it went away. But when you look at what I've outlined here in the past, obviously I'm a little bit favored toward him, having worked with him and still work with him. If you look at his personal approaches And if you look at the philosophy that he brought to the table in terms of dealing with the international community, it's probably a good yardstick for any administration to follow. And I could understand that on the basis of this, that there is some nostalgia looking back to trying to get the process and the philosophy in place that George Bush had followed during his own time in office. Ed, I think I'm talking a little too much. I think I'm going to stop here. Thank all of you for being kind enough to listen. And Ed, thank you again for having me.
Thank you very much, Roma. We're going to have some time for questions. Can I say an anecdote to exemplify the diplomacy and the personal touch of President Bush? When I was ambassador to Syria, we were negotiating the release of American hostages, you'll remember, from Beirut. And I had sent a telegram back to Washington that I got word that an American hostage was going to be released. I was going to the Syrian Foreign Ministry. So I get word back that the president wanted to talk to me. Was going to call. So I was sitting down in the residence in Damascus, and I had these papers. I wanted to make sure I had all the information in front of me before the president called. And I had all these papers on my knees and everything, and then the telephone rings. And a young voice saying, is this Ambassador Georgian? I said, this is Ambassador Georgian. Ambassador Georgian, the next voice you are going to hear is that of the President of the United States of America. Well, I was so damn impressed that I stood up. Now, I've dealt with the president. And all my briefing papers fell on the paper. And I was talking, and the president got on the line. And he said, Ed, I said, yes, Mr. President. He said, do we know who it is? I said, we don't know yet. I'll only know when I'm at the foreign ministry. He said, well, just let us know whoever it is as soon as you know. And I would like to call him, but ask him if he is up to speaking with me. And then let me know before I call him. Which is really and then the last thing he said really bothered me. He said, and by the way, Ed, I'll be watching you on CNN tonight. But I think that exemplifies a lot what Roman was saying about this man and his personal touch and diplomacy. Now, open, Judy.
Roman, that was really wonderful. In the Gulf War, when the troops were close to Baghdad and we could have gone all the way, though I know the mandate from the UN was, I think, only to Baghdad or whatever it was. Was there any opportunity looking back where perhaps leading countries could have quickly come together to say we must go all the way, or what?
That thought never really crossed the president's mind. Let me tell you, we got a lot of criticism at that time for not going into Baghdad. People said we should have gone into Baghdad. There were a number of reasons why we didn't, and Ed, you could feel free to join in any time because you were involved on the Middle East side of this. In not any sequential order, but number one, for example, there was the great fear that if you went on to Baghdad, you'd break the mandate of the UN, which would then upset the Arab countries and maybe create a greater war in the Middle East and undermine the U.S. credibility in terms of what we promised. The other issue, of course, was there was a strong sense that given the type of shock that Saddam Hussein's Republican Guard and his military had taken, and he, in terms of his own political prestige, that there was no way that he would be able to withstand that. And I think we kind of guessed wrong here. We thought that he would fall of his own weight of the loss of the war, all right? But he turned out to be a lot stronger than we had realized. The other problem was, is if you went into Baghdad, you owned it, and that would have created problems in its own way. And I don't think the United States, that never crossed our minds, because of the other two issues I just mentioned. But, a lot of people ask us that question. No one really asks us that question now.
What could I do?
Roman, I'll just remind you of the story that the president told the Secretary Baker about being in the White House with Gorbachev and Shevardnadze and Skopov. and they talked about Germany, at the reunification of Germany, putting Germany in NATO. You might elaborate on that if you recall it.
Well,
that was very
it goes beyond the White House thing. There were a lot of meetings. There were so many of them. Will, the one you're probably referring to is when the president asked Gorbachev about would a unified Germany be able to join NATO, and Gorbachev said yes, and there was a lot of surprise on our side. And I think it was Jim that passed a note, have him say it again or something like that, because we just couldn't believe it. And it passed, and Gorbachev kind of reaffirmed that yes, that the Soviet Union would be open to whatever the Germans wanted to do. I think the heart of that story, Will, is what I said at the outset of my comments was the trust that had developed between the two individuals. And it was Gorbachev that said on President Bush's 80th birthday celebration in Houston that it was this trust factor that developed between himself and George Bush that was able to pave the way toward that kind of relationship where they trusted that neither one would take advantage of the other. And I think that went to the heart of the matter of that German issue that you just raised, Will.
It was just so amazing how something so momentous happens in such an informal way. I mean, it's just because of his personality.
You're absolutely right. I mean, you think, that when you read your history books, it's 40 pages outlining this or that, and all that happened was like 12 seconds or something, it seems, in terms of 2 or 3 sentences that people say back and forth. Yeah. Judy, you had another follow-up?
Well, I was going to ask you about when the after you all didn't go into Baghdad, which I completely understand why, but then the helicopters took off, and didn't they spray or dump on the Kurds in the north? So there were all these decisions that had to be made afterwards. Were they made by Secretary of Defense, et cetera, or was he very much involved?
The president was involved. I mean, what you're referring to, I think it was Operation Hope. If I forget the exact name. This was what Judy is referring to is that Saddam started attacking the Kurdish minorities in northern Iraq, and the United States, in order to protect them, did the no-fly zones, and we flew our aircraft out there as a humanitarian mission to prevent the attacking of the Kurds in that situation. But we weren't going to get involved in the internal politics of Baghdad. Yes, sir.
Roman, there's been a lot written about Afghanistan.
Are you guys all trying to get even with me, Charles? I mean, all these questions are Will.
And looking, hindsight's perfect 20/20, but it's very common to say that after the Soviets were driven out of Afghanistan, we forgot it. And just, I know that was in the Reagan administration, went over into the Bush administration. Was there ever any thought about maybe doing something more in Afghanistan after the Soviets left?
I can't recall anything in terms of a substantive nature that we thought about doing in Afghanistan. When the Soviets pulled out, it followed in the wake of the British tradition. The Brits hadn't been able to accomplish much in Afghanistan, as you know the history. And the Soviets obviously took a hard loss in Afghanistan. But there was never, at that time, Afghanistan wasn't on our radar screen like the other parts of the world were at that time. Okay. Yes, sir.
This may be a question that you answered with Judy's, but subsequent to driving the Iraqis out of Kuwait, there was a lot of indication in the public, at least, that we sort of encouraged the folks in the south of Iraq to rise up against Saddam Hussein, and then we never gave them any weapons that they thought they would be getting. Can you comment on that, or was that just...
I think that kind of falls into the domain of the answer that I gave you. We expected people. I don't think we actively fomented anyone. I can't recollect to rise up. There was an expectation that, given the big loss that Saddam had undertaken, both in terms of the military power that he had lost, and in terms of the political prestige within his own society that he lost, that he would not be able to remain in power, and he would fall of his own weight. As I mentioned, that assumption proved erroneous on our part.
Okay, I think it's time to sign some books.
That's it?
Thank you very much.
No. Thank you.